Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the Atlantic slave trade, which is from section 4.3 in your textbook. So, for this guided reading, there's a few different major questions that are at the top of each box, and then as we go through, we apply different ideas or people or concepts to these questions. So the first question says, how did the following contribute to the development of the Atlantic slave trade? And the first thing we're going to look at here, number one, is European colonization of the Americas. And so when the Europeans colonized the Americas, they a lot of times were looking for cheap labor. And at first, they, especially in certain areas, they forced Native Americans to work for them. A lot of times mining gold or working on plantations or sugar plantations. But unfortunately and sadly, many of these Native Americans died for a couple of reasons. One was because they were continually being exposed to diseases that they hadn't been in contact with. So many of them were dying from diseases. Millions and millions of natives died. But people were also dying from harsh conditions. And so, as many of these people died, as many of these natives that were forced to work died, Europeans wanted to replace that labor force some way. And so they started to bring Africans in to replace the natives in these places where the labor was needed. Next question, the same question again. Next point goes to how did Portuguese settlement of Brazil contribute to the development of the slave trade? And well, basically what happened was sugar was one of the main crops grown in Brazil and was very profitable for the Portuguese in their colony in Brazil. Um, and so it was also very labor intensive, meaning that it takes a lot of work, a lot of hard work to be able to grow the sugar, to raise those kinds of crops. And so because there was a high need for labor, sugar meant there was a high demand for slave labor. And this was for two reasons. One is because there was really high profits. Sugar was making a lot of money for the Portuguese, and so they needed more. They wanted to expand this as much as they could. And secondly, there was a very high death rate among the workers. Sugar plantations had very high death rates. A lot of the slaves that went there the average age was not very high in death, meaning that people were dying very young because of the hard working conditions. And so sugar definitely, the sugar expansion of sugar and the idea of getting more and more labor definitely contributed to the Atlantic slave trade. The next point we're going to talk a little bit about is African rulers. And so, as you might remember from what we've learned, it wasn't just Europeans stealing and kidnapping Africans from Africa to take to the Americas. African rulers also contributed. First of all, they helped deliver slaves from the interior of Africa. So they would kind of work to capture people, to kidnap people, and bring them to the coast to sell to Europeans. The reason that they did this was because there was an economic benefit for them. The Europeans brought guns, other materials that they would trade, and also they would pay the African rulers in gold. So there was a real incentive here offered by the Europeans for the African rulers to contribute to the Atlantic slave trade. The last group we're going to talk about are African merchants. So these kind of would have been the people that would have their trade would have been people. They would have been stealing people from the African interior, taking them to the coast. So the leaders, African leaders may have helped, but the merchants were also the ones that were going to get people and steal them to take them to sell them. And so these were the people that would buy and sell the slaves or steal and acquire the slaves to be able to sell them. And at times there were African rulers that opposed the slave trade. But because the profits were so high, because the demand was there, because the Europeans were bringing gold and guns and other goods, these African merchants would find other trade routes around African rulers that may oppose the slave trade. right? So when there's high enough profits, people will usually smuggle or find a way to sell things. Okay. Now, we're going to change the question a little bit now. The question now is, what were the consequences of the Atlantic slave trade for each of the following? So the first group we're going to look at is African societies. There was a huge population drain, and what that means is that they were losing a lot of people, right? The slaves that were being kidnapped and taken would have been some of their strongest, best workers. And those people are being taken and stolen away from African societies over hundreds of years. It was millions of people that were taken over that time period. Another consequence is the spread of guns, which also helped with the spread of warfare and devastation in Africa. Remember, the slave traders were bringing guns as one of the goods that they would trade in order to get African slaves. And with the prevalence of guns increasing in Africa, that led to more war and devastation among the people of Africa. Next is, what were the consequences for enslaved Africans during the Atlantic slave trade? So a couple things here. First of all, they're being separated from their families. When people were stolen to be taken to the slave trade, there was no consideration whatsoever of how that would affect not only them, but also their family. And so there was a lot of family separation going on. We've also looked at a bit about the Middle Passage, this harsh and really cruel journey of how Africans are transported. Very cruel conditions, a very traumatic experience, and one in which 20% of the people never even made it across the ocean. They were killed or thrown overboard along the way. And additionally, once the slaves were brought over, a lot of them have very difficult lives. I talked a little bit about the harshness and the high death rate at the sugar plantations, but people were being forced to work. They weren't being paid. They were being treated like objects, bought and sold. You can see in this picture as this slave is inspected as if he's an animal, a piece of merchandise for the person going to buy him there. And so these lives were not easy lives and were often quite difficult for the slaves when they were brought over to the Americas. How are the American colonies affected? Well, first of all, the American colonies received a lot of economic and cultural development from slave labor. Particularly, we're going to talk about economic here. That cheap labor, as in free labor, really helped to build the economies of the colonies in a lot of different ways. This labor force that the Africans that were forced in the slave trade provided also helped the colonies to survive. We've talked about a couple times how difficult it was sometimes for some of the colonies. Well, without the labor of these slaves, a lot of the colonies wouldn't have been able to survive. And then additionally, over time, many of the colonies become very profitable. We spoke about how Jamestown eventually turned to tobacco to be able to be a profitable colony. Well, a lot of the tobacco fields over time were worked by slaves. And so the money that was coming in that the European colonizers and settlers were profiting from, a lot of that was based on the slave labor from Africans that had been transported there. Finally, the last consequence that we're going to talk about is how Africans still influence present-day American cultures. So many countries in the Americas and islands in the Caribbean, they have significant African minority groups. And these groups often, not only can they be mixed race groups, but they also contribute culturally to our world today, right? And if you think about it, some of the music that we listen to, even here in Latin America, such as Daddy Yankee or other groups, these have a lot of influence from African musical traditions. We also closely follow the Ecuadorian football team. And so that's a good example because a lot of the players there are from African descent. And so those are ways in which present-day American cultures are still influenced today by the African slave trade. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll see you in class tomorrow.